The bitter wind howls across an endless white horizon. The snow is not soft, but biting, sharp as shards of glass carried on the breath of the Eurasian steppe. Temperatures plunge far below what modern humans can imagine, 40 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that burns the skin, freezes the breath in your lungs, and steals life in minutes. This was not the exception, but the rule, for months on end. For half the year, winter locked these vast lands in a suffocating grip. The ground became iron, rivers vanished beneath thick crusts of ice, and the landscape seemed to defy human existence. Modern traveler, stripped of heated shelters, insulated jackets, and endless supplies of food, would last only a handful of hours here before cold would claim them. And yet, 30,000 years ago, entire families did more than endure these conditions. They flourished. They raised children beneath the crackle of firelight, crafted objects of astonishing beauty, and told stories that would echo down to us in fragments of bone, stone, and art. This paradox is at the heart of human history. How did our ancestors, armed only with stone tools and what nature provided, not merely survive but carve a life in what appears to us as a frozen hell? For centuries, the popular image has been simply humans huddled at the mouths of caves, clutching furs close to their bodies, surviving by luck and fire alone. But archaeology has peeled back that image like layers of frozen earth, and what we find beneath is astonishing. These people were not fragile primitives, shivering in the dark. They were engineers, builders, and innovators who turned their harshest enemy, the cold itself, into a tool for survival. The first revelation is this: when nature threatens you, you do not fight it head-on, you make it work for you. Snow, ice, wind, and bone became allies, transformed by human ingenuity into shelter, warmth, and safety. It was a philosophy born of necessity, but one so effective that it allowed humans to conquer environments no other primate could endure. At Kostroma, in Russia, evidence suggests this engineering mindset may have been present as early as 800,000 years ago. Archaeologists uncovered vast circular depressions, deliberately dug into the earth, where families built semi-subterranean homes. To the untrained eye, they might look like little more than holes in the ground, but the choice was deliberate and brilliant. Below the frost line, the earth itself became insulation. Even in the dead of winter, 6 to 8 feet below the surface, soil temperatures remained far warmer than the icy air above. By building within the ground, they harnessed nature's own thermal stability, creating dwellings that could mean the difference between life and death. Think of this for a moment. Without thermometers, without science as we know it, they understood the language of the land. Tool marks show these depressions were not random but precise, carved to depths where warmth could be drawn from the earth itself. In their own way, these were the first experiments in environmental engineering, a legacy that echoes in our modern basements and earth-insulated houses today. And this was only the beginning. As millennia passed, their knowledge deepened. They learned to layer materials for insulation, to manage fire not only for warmth but for air quality, to design shelters so advanced that modern Arctic engineers still study them with admiration. These shelters were not crude. They were masterpieces of survival, each one a collaboration between human ingenuity and the resources of the natural world. From mammoth bone houses in Ukraine to reed-insulated shelters in Central Europe, they reveal a story of adaptation, of trial and error carried across generations, of people who could look into the frozen void of winter and say, "We will endure." Yet the story is not merely about structures of wood, bone, and hide. It is about what those structures meant. They were walls against the cold, yes, but also wombs of community where children learned to walk, where stories were sung into the night, where minds found the space to create art even as the ice pressed close outside. Within these shelters, humanity became more than a species of survival. It became a species of culture. So the question deepens. How exactly did they do it? What techniques did they invent? What secrets of architecture and fire, of bone and hide, allowed them to stay alive through winters that could easily erase the unprepared? To answer this, we must journey deeper into their world, into the excavation pits at Kostroma, the mammoth bone circles of Mazirik, the layered walls of Dolny Vestinis. These places hold the traces of genius, whispers of people who lived lives as fragile and as powerful as our own. The tale of humanity's coldest triumph begins not with brute strength, but with the quiet art of building. Long before the great mammoth bone houses rose across the frozen plains, humanity's ancestors had already begun experimenting with the problem of winter survival. At Kostroma, in central Russia, archaeologists uncovered a mystery. Great circular depressions carved into the earth, dating back nearly 800,000 years. To the casual observer, they might seem like the remnants of ancient pits or the scars of erosion. But close study revealed something remarkable. These were the foundations of homes, deliberately engineered against the cold. Each depression measured up to 12 feet across and 8 feet deep, a cavernous hollow dug into the frozen soil. At first, the sheer effort required seems baffling. Why dig so far into the ground, where each swing of a tool against frozen earth would have demanded hours of grueling labor? The answer is simple, yet profound: temperature stability. Above ground, the Ice Age air could fall to temperatures that would freeze flesh within minutes. But below the frost line, the soil held to a steady warmth, often 20 to 30 degrees, higher than the surface. It was a law of nature our ancestors discovered through observation and intuition. Dig deep enough, and the earth itself would protect you. This was not guesswork. The consistency of the excavations suggests planning and precision. Tool marks show deliberate shaping, not random burrowing. They knew, even then, where safety lay. And this choice of digging down into the earth would echo through millennia. Semi-subterranean houses became a hallmark of cold-climate architecture. From ancient Siberia to the Inuit sod houses of the Arctic thousands of years later. Inside these depressions, roofs and walls would have been constructed from whatever materials the environment provided: branches, reeds, hides, packed earth. Archaeological traces hint at fire hearths placed carefully at the center, their smoke vented through small openings. It is here, perhaps, where we see the first sparks of true human architecture, not merely a shelter of convenience, but a calculated space engineered to sustain life. To imagine the people who built them, one must think beyond mere survival. Picture the scene: the wind howling above the steppe, while inside the earth-warmed hollow, the air remains calm. Families gather close to a small fire, smoke curling upwards through a narrow vent. A mother hums softly to soothe a child, while others sharpen stone tools or strip meat from a hunt. The cold is still present, it seeps through every surface, but the balance has shifted. For the first time, humans were shaping the land itself into an ally. The importance of this step cannot be overstated. Every act of engineering begins with recognition. A problem exists, and it can be solved. At Kostroma, humans confronted winter not as an unchangeable force, but as a challenge to be answered. Their solution: dig into the soil to harness its hidden warmth marks one of the earliest expressions of that distinct human trait: the ability to alter the environment deliberately. With foresight and purpose, modern survival experts still teach a similar principle. In Arctic training programs, soldiers and explorers are taught to carve snow caves or dig into the earth, relying on insulation hidden beneath the surface. The earth remains constant while the wind above shifts and howls. What the Paleolithic pioneers did was the same, but with stone tools, bare hands, and knowledge earned at a terrible price. Those who misjudged, who built shallow, who failed to vent smoke correctly, would not have survived to pass on their mistakes. It is striking, too, to think that these earliest architects were not yet us. At 800,000 years ago, the builders of Kostroma might have been Homo erectus, or perhaps an early branch of archaic humans. Yet even they possessed the imagination to see the ground not simply as a surface to walk upon, but as a medium to be shaped into protection. In this way, the depressions at Kostroma are more than archaeological curiosities. They are milestones, proof that long before the great cave paintings of Europe, or the sculpted figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, there was a different kind of creativity, the creativity of necessity. It was in the frozen mud and the cut of a stone tool that human innovation began to reveal itself most clearly. From these first pits, the story of shelter expands outward. Over time, humans would refine their methods, layer their walls with grasses and hides, and eventually raise bone cathedrals against the snow. But here, in these circles carved from earth, we see the seed of an idea that would carry humanity across continents, the knowledge that survival was not luck, but design. By the time humanity reached the heart of Ice Age Europe, survival had evolved beyond mere excavation of the earth. At Dolní Vlastenice, in what is now the Czech Republic, roughly 26,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered evidence of something far more sophisticated than a pit in the ground. Here, our ancestors built walls not of stone, but of layers. Insulation, in the truest sense of the word, was born. The remains reveal a pattern of construction, so methodical it reads almost like the blueprint of a modern architect. First came the inner lining, carefully prepared hides, stretched taut with the fur turned inward. This simple detail was revolutionary. The fur, pressed against the living space, trapped pockets of air close to the occupant's skin, reducing heat loss, in a way not unlike the down jackets we rely on today. Over these hides, builders added layers of dried grasses and moss. Far from random stuffing, these acted like natural fibers, absorbing moisture that would otherwise gather as condensation and chill the air. Finally, woven mats of reeds and bark formed the outer skin, bracing the structure against icy wind, yet still allowing vapor to escape. It was a three-part harmony of warmth, dryness, and breathability. Archaeologists marvel at this, because such a composite system would not appear again in human history until millennia later, with the invention of multi-layered wall construction in modern housing. And yet, here it was, devised by Paleolithic families with bone needles, sinew thread, and the quiet genius of trial and error. One can almost picture how this knowledge emerged. Perhaps one winter, a family lined their shelter with hides alone, only to find frost forming on the inner walls, dripping and freezing again in cycles that turned the interior into a damp prison. Another family, adding moss and grasses, noticed the difference. The shelter stayed dry, the air warmer, the fire more efficient. Word spread not in textbooks, but in stories, in practice, in the careful teaching of children who watched their elders prepare each layer. This was more than technical ingenuity. It was cultural transmission. For the system to persist, each detail had to be remembered and repeated without error, for a missed layer might mean sickness or death. Knowledge itself became a survival tool, as vital as a spear or fire. The choice of materials speaks volumes about their relationship with the land. They were not passive collectors, but selective engineers. Mosses and grasses had to be harvested at the right time of year, dried carefully to prevent rot. Reeds and bark were gathered and woven with intention, their textures chosen for strength against wind. Even the hides themselves were prepared through processes of scraping, curing, and sewing. What we see is not a desperate improvisation, but a deliberate system and ecological partnership, where every plant and animal around them played a role in keeping the community alive. There is a haunting beauty in this, for insulation is not something we think of as art. Yet in the hands of these people, it was both functional and aesthetic. Imagine stepping into such a shelter. The inner walls lined with pale fur glowing softly in the firelight. The scent of dried grasses mingling with smoke. The reed mats rustling faintly as the wind pressed outside. This was not just survival. It was comfort, even warmth, wrested from a world that seemed designed to extinguish it. Modern comparisons make their achievement even clearer. In today's Arctic, indigenous peoples, such as the Inuit, perfected igloos, snow houses that rely on the same principle: layers, air pockets, and breathable insulation. The genius of Dolní Vlastenice belongs to this same tradition, proof that humans across time converged on similar solutions when confronted with the same relentless cold. And there is another, subtler truth. To build in layers is to think abstractly, to envision not just the present moment but a system of cause and effect. Hide traps warmth. Grass stops moisture. Reeds block wind. It is problem-solving at a level that hints at the intellectual leap defining our species. These shelters were classrooms in disguise, teaching their builders the logic of systems, the chain of consequences that is the heart of science and engineering. From the earth-dug hollows of Kostroma to the layered insulation of Dolní Vlastenice, the story is clear. Our ancestors were not stumbling through survival by instinct alone. They were experimenting, improving, passing on knowledge. And in the process, they laid the foundations for the monumental architecture of ice and bone that would soon rise on the steppes of Ukraine and Russia. A new stage in humanity's dialogue with winter. The ground had been tamed, the walls perfected. Now it was time to build monuments of endurance that would stand for millennia, the mammoth bone houses. On the wide, windswept plains of Ukraine and southern Russia, archaeologists have uncovered what might be the most extraordinary dwellings of the ice age. The mammoth bone houses. To call them huts would be a disservice. They were cathedrals of survival, carefully engineered shelters rising out of landscapes stripped bare by winter, where wood was scarce. And the horizon stretched endless and treeless, at sites like Mazyrik, Kostenki, and Mazyrik's, lesser-known neighbors along the Dnieper and Don rivers. Circular or oval structures were unearthed, built not from branches or stone, but from the bones of giants. Imagine approaching such a settlement 20,000 years ago. Massive skulls and tusks arching into a dome. Ribs interlocked like the beams of a cathedral. Hundreds of bones fitted together in careful symmetry. Some of these houses measured nearly 16 feet across, large enough to house extended families of 8 to 12 people through the endless months of darkness and snow. The process of construction was nothing short of monumental. First, builders dug a shallow depression into the earth, forming the base. The excavated soil was not wasted, was heaped into a berm circling the structure, a protective wall against the shrieking winds. Into this depression, the framework rose. Mammoth skulls, some weighing over 200 pounds, laid as foundation stones. Tusks, curved and enormous, formed the arcs of a roof. Long bones, femurs, humeri, ribs were set like beams, angled and braced, to bear the weight of hides and snow. Smaller bones filled the gaps, wedged into place with precision. One striking revelation from radiocarbon dating is that many of these bones were not fresh kills. They came from long-dead mammoths, scavenged from natural boneyards. This was no reckless slaughter for building material, but an organized system of collection. Families must have returned to known sites where carcasses lay, hauling enormous loads back to their settlements, working communally to raise the framework of their winter fortresses. To modernize, the site would have been staggering. Where we see a structure, they likely saw something more, a symbol of survival, a monument to human triumph over the beasts and the cold alike. It is not hard to imagine that these houses carried a weight of ritual, living within the bones of the mammoth, the very creature that sustained them with meat. Hides, ivory, and fuel must have carried deep symbolic meaning. Each house was more than a dwelling, it was an embodiment of the relationship between humans and the colossal animals of their world. Consider the labor involved. Experimental archaeology suggests that erecting such a house required weeks of concentrated effort, with 8 to 10 adults working daily. It was an undertaking not for an individual, but for a community. Children, too, must have played their part, carrying grasses, fetching smaller bones, or helping to sew the hides that would eventually drape the bone skeleton. These shelters were acts of collective resilience, binding families and groups together in shared purpose. It is tempting to view them as primitive igloos of bone, but the engineering was far more sophisticated. By arranging bones in a dome or oval, builders distributed weight evenly, ensuring stability against storms and snow loads. The berms of earth added thermal mass, preventing wind from tearing away the hides stretched across the frame. The design was not accidental. It was precise, repeatable, and effective. To step into one of these houses would have been to enter a world apart from the frozen plains outside. Firelight flickering across mammoth skulls, tusks curving overhead like the ribs of some immense beast, the air warmed by hidden hearths. It was not only shelter, it was transformation. Outside was the void of cold and hunger. Inside was community, warmth, and the possibility of life. Even today, their presence haunts us. Archaeologists, kneeling in the soil of Kostenki or Mazyrik, brush away earth to reveal patterns of bones still lying in place, testaments to the ingenuity of long-forgotten hands. To hold a mammoth rib that once formed the wall of a house is to touch not only survival, but imagination. The audacity to bend the remains of nature's most powerful creatures into monuments against the cold. The mammoth bone houses remind us that architecture is never just about shelter. It is about identity, belonging, and the story a community tells about itself. These Ice Age families lived not as scattered fugitives of the cold, but as builders of enduring homes, as engineers who mastered both earth and bone to carve out warmth where none should exist. Their walls of tusk and skulls stood as proof humanity had learned to claim the frozen steppe as its own. The skeleton of mammoth bone was only the beginning. To transform the cold lattice of tusks and skulls into a living home, Paleolithic builders wrapped their structures in skin-thick layers of hide and fur that created a second, softer wall. These coverings were not makeshift, but meticulously engineered. The outermost shell was formed from heavy mammoth hides, vast sheets sewn together with sinew thread. Bone needles, carefully shaped and polished, stitched these enormous panels, with a skill that speaks of generations of practice. Imagine the labor, stretching hides the size of sailcloth, piercing them with painstaking regularity, and sewing seams strong enough to withstand the fury of Ice Age storms. Inside, additional layers of smaller pelts created a microclimate of warmth. Fox, wolf, hair-rich, animal's fur added its own properties. The thick guard hairs of wolves repelled moisture, while the dense undercoat of Arctic hares trapped heat. These inner linings created not just insulation but comfort, a softness against which families could rest and sleep. In effect, the architecture and the clothing of the Paleolithic world were born of the same techniques, converging in a single principle: survival depended on mastering the properties of fur and hide. The coverings were anchored with a system as intricate as the sewing itself. Hides were lashed to bone frameworks with rawhide thongs, secured by toggles carved from antler and bone. These toggles allowed adjustments, tightening or loosening as the weather changed, much like the fastenings on modern tents. Archaeologists have found evidence of hide flaps at certain sites, movable panels that could be shifted to open or close ventilation. What seems to us as primitive improvisation reveals itself instead as a carefully designed system of modular parts, adaptable to the shifting demands of weather. The brilliance of this lies in the layering. A single mammoth hide could keep out the wind, but it would also trap moisture inside, eventually turning the interior into a damp cavern. By layering hides with lighter furs, moss, and grasses, the builders created insulation that breathed, preventing condensation while maintaining warmth. It is the same principle used in high-performance outdoor gear today. Not one layer, but many, each serving a distinct purpose. And what of the tools that made this possible? Bone needles, some scarcely thicker than a modern sewing pin, testify to astonishing craftsmanship. To shape such delicate instruments from brittle bone required both skill and patience. Their existence tells us that sewing, something we often take for granted, was one of the most revolutionary technologies of prehistory. Without it, hides would remain awkward sheets. With it, they became walls, clothing, and blankets that could turn lethal winters into survivable seasons. The parallels to clothing are striking. Just as shelters were layered with different materials, so too were garments. Archaeological evidence suggests people wore multiple furs sewn together, much like the onion principle of modern cold weather gear. The same design logic that insulated a dwelling also wrapped the human body. Shelter and clothing were not separate inventions, but two expressions of the same insight. Life could be prolonged, even made bearable, if nature's materials were not simply used but combined. Picture one of these shelters complete: a dome of bone, its frame hidden beneath the heavy stitched skin of mammoth, its interior walls softened by layers of fox and hare. Smoke from a central fire darkens the upper hides, staining them with soot. At the seams, toggles hold the coverings, taut against the winter winds. To step inside is to feel the muffling of the storm, the air warmer, drier, alive with the scent of fur and smoke. Outside lies the endless void of white. Inside, the breath of life endures. There is a poetry in this vision: humans taking the very animals they depended upon and transforming them into both clothing and shelter. Mammoths provided not only food and tools, but the very walls against which families pressed their backs at night. Foxes and wolves, once predators and competitors, became contributors to human warmth. Nothing was wasted. Everything became part of the architecture of survival. The story of these walls of fur and anchors of bone is one of ingenuity. Yes, but also of intimacy with the natural world. These people did not simply conquer their environment. They collaborated with it, weaving life and death into structures of endurance. The bone frames gave shape, the hides gave warmth, and together they formed not a hut but a sanctuary. And within these sanctuaries, another element gave life its heartbeat, the fire. Carefully tended at the center of it all, around which families gathered, and the long nights passed. No shelter, no matter how well constructed, could endure the Ice Age without fire. In the heart of the mammoth bone houses, amid the layers of hides and walls of bone, the hearth glowed. It was more than a practical necessity. Fire was warmth, safety, light, and spirit. It was the pulse of the home, the thin line separating life from death. Archaeological excavations at Mazirik and Kostenki have revealed not just one hearth, but several central fires surrounded by secondary heating stations carefully distributed around the dwelling. This was deliberate. A single large fire in the center would have wasted fuel and filled the shelter with smoke. By dividing heat into multiple smaller fires, warmth could be spread evenly, while consumption was minimized. It was an engineering solution refined over generations, a strategy of efficiency born of scarcity, and scarcity was ever present. In the treeless expanses of the steppe, firewood was rare. Families could not depend on logs or branches as we might today. Instead, they turned to what the land and their companions provided. Dried grasses bound into bundles, animal dung pressed and cured, even the very bones of mammoths and other great beasts. To the modern ear, burning bones sounds strange, almost desperate, but chemical analysis of hearth remains confirms it. Bone burns hot and steady when properly prepared, releasing long-lasting heat that could keep a shelter habitable, even when temperatures outside plunged to lethal levels. Imagine the resourcefulness this required. After a mammoth was butchered for meat, its bones became more than tools. They became fuel, their fat and marrow sustaining flames long into the night. Dung, gathered carefully and dried, became another lifeline. Where we might see waste, they saw energy, proof again of their extraordinary capacity to transform every element of their world into survival. But fire was never only about heat. In the long darkness of winter, fire gave light, casting flickering shadows across tusks and hides. Around its glow, families gathered. Children played at its edge, carving small figures from ivory or shaping clay into tiny animals, some of which archaeologists still find buried in the earth. Elders, their faces creased by smoke and time, told stories, myths of the hunt, of spirits that lived in the mammoth or the fox, of ancestors who endured winters even harsher than this one. Fire was the cradle of memory, the theater of imagination. The hearth also created order within the home. Around its warmth, daily life took shape. Food was prepared. Hides were softened and smoked. Tools were repaired under its light. The positioning of hearths inside mammoth bone houses reveals careful planning. Some fires dedicated to cooking, others to heating workspaces, others to drying meat or hides. The dwelling itself became a map of human activity, oriented around the fire-like planets around a sun. We must also consider the danger. Too much smoke could suffocate, and fire was as capable of destroying as it was of saving. The placement of vents, the regulation of flames, the timing of fuel all required constant vigilance. The people of the Ice Age became masters of fire management, not through chance, but because their lives demanded it. Even now, Arctic explorers and soldiers are taught what those ancestors already knew. A poorly tended fire can kill as surely as cold. And yet, within this danger, fire carried something beyond survival. It offered companionship, the crackle of flame, the rhythmic feeding of fuel. The hypnotic dance of Emberzal gave a rhythm to nights otherwise filled with silence and frost. Around it, songs could be sung, laughter shared, quiet moments of tenderness exchanged. Fire, in its glow, transformed mere endurance into community. When we imagine those winters, it is easy to focus only on the brutal cold, but to step into one of these shelters in our minds, to sit by the hearth as smoke curls upward through a hide vent, is to feel the humanity of it. It was here, in the frozen dark, that fire wove survival into culture. For while walls of bone and hide could protect against the wind, it was fire that gave life its warmth, its gathering place, its light against the endless night. From the outside, the mammoth bone houses must have looked like crude heap-slow domes of hide stretched across tangled ivory, half buried in snow. Yet beneath that raw exterior lay geometry, a quiet architecture that reveals the mind of their builders. Archaeologists mapping the layouts at sites like Mazarek and Kostenki discovered patterns that defy randomness. The houses were not haphazard piles of bone and hide but circles, ellipses, and ovals, measured and repeated with striking consistency. Entrances often faced east or southeast, aligned to greet the morning sun and shield interiors from the prevailing western winds. The very orientation of the dwellings shows foresight. These were people not only reacting to their environment, but anticipating it, shaping their homes in dialogue with the elements. Inside, space was ordered. The central hearth was rarely exactly in the middle, but slightly offset, its placement optimizing airflow and smoke escape. Sleeping areas curved along the walls, padded with furs and grasses, while workspaces clustered near the firelight. Storage pits were dug into the floor, sometimes lined with stone or bone, cool caches for meat and fat. Even waste had its place. Layers reveal areas used consistently for discard, kept away from living zones. What we see is zoning, an architectural principle still found in every modern home: places to rest, to work, to eat, to discard. The size of the dwellings speaks to social life. Some were small, just 4 to 5 meters across, likely housing a single family. Others spanned up to 7 meters, large enough for multiple hearths and several families together. The choice of size reflects more than population, it reflects strategy. In harsher winters, larger communal shelters may have concentrated warmth and conserved resources, while smaller huts offered independence and mobility. The community flexed its architecture like a living organism, adapting the shape of its homes to the pressures of climate and need. Beyond the walls themselves, traces of external structures hint at further complexity. At several sites, rings of mammoth bones form not houses but windbreaks, open-air walls that shielded but did not cover. These may have protected workspaces for butchering, hide scraping, or tool-making, allowing people to work in partial shelter without the risk of smoke buildup indoors. Some rings may have served as corrals for dogs, early partners in hunting and transport. Others could have been ritual spaces, bone circles, where stories, songs, and ceremonies unfolded beneath the stars. The geometry of these spaces reflects more than practicality, reflects a worldview. To build in circles and ellipses is to embrace forms of wholeness, continuity, and enclosure. The house became a microcosm, a miniature world carved from bone and hide. With the fire as its sun, the walls as its horizon. The entrance was a threshold, a liminal boundary between chaos and order, wilderness and hearth. It is tempting to think of architecture as beginning with cities, temples, and stone walls. But its roots lie here, in the silent geometry of ice age homes. These people carried in their minds a spatial imagination, that life could be organized, space could be structured, and form could embody meaning. The mammoth bone houses, with their circles, their symmetry, and their ordered interiors, stand as the first whispers of an architectural language humanity would one day speak in cathedrals and towers. And yet, as profound as these dwellings were, they were not meant to last forever. Built to withstand winters, they were eventually abandoned, their bones collapsing back into the earth. Families moved on with the herds, carrying with them the knowledge of shape, orientation, layering, and fire. The ruins they left behind are less like monuments, and more like fossils of thought, impressions of a mind that had begun to think architecturally. The hidden geometry of these shelters reveals the most important truth of all. Survival was not only a matter of warmth and food, but of order, foresight, and imagination. With bone, hide, and fire, humans did not merely endure the ice age, they designed their way through it. And as settlements grew and ideas spread, another dimension of this architecture emerged: the communal landscape, the clustering of homes, the first hints of villages taking root in the frozen ground. When we picture the Ice Age, we often imagine solitary families trudging across endless plains, isolated and small against the horizon. Yet the archaeological record tells another story. In places like Mizirakigansi and Kastenki, mammoth bone houses were not built in isolation. They gathered in clusters 2, 5, even a dozen shelters forming the outlines of early villages. To stand at one of these sites 20,000 years ago would have been to see, not a lone hut, but a community. Domes of hide and bone rising side by side, smoke curling into the frozen sky, pathways of trampled snow connecting doorways. Between the dwellings lay shared spaces, areas where butchering took place, where hides were stretched on frames, where fires burned openly for collective use. These were not temporary camps scattered by chance. They were planned clusters, human landscapes inscribed onto the steppe. The arrangement of houses within these villages reveals patterns of cooperation. Entrances often opened toward common areas, creating courtyards where work and social life overlapped. Bones and refuse were piled into designated dumps at the edges, keeping central spaces cleaner. At some sites, archaeologists have found storage pits large enough to hold hundreds of kilograms of meat, far beyond the needs of one family. This suggests food was not only stored collectively, but shared a strategy of survival that bound people together through reciprocity. And yet, these were not permanent towns. The villages pulsed with the rhythm of the mammoth herds. In winter, when animals gathered on the steppe and hides were needed most, people settled for months at a time, raising their bone houses and stockpiling meat. But come spring and summer, the settlements were abandoned. Families dispersed, following reindeer, horses, and fish, only to return when the cycle demanded. These were villages of season and necessity, returning to the same sacred grounds again and again until the earth itself bore the imprint of their lives. What would daily life have felt like in such a village? At dawn, smoke lifts as hearths are stirred back to life. Hunters gather at the edge, spears tipped with stone and ivory, preparing for the day's work. In the central spaces, women scrape hides with flint tools, children carry dung and grasses. For fuel, elders sit near the warmth, carving bone into needles or shaping ivory beads for necklaces. Dogs, already domesticated partners by this time, circle the camp, alert to both danger and opportunity. Laughter and arguments rise above the wind. In this frozen world, the village beats like a heart, and there was art, too, in the refuse. Of Mizirik, archaeologists unearthed carved ivory figurines, pendants, and even fragments of decorated bone. One mammoth tusk bears incised lines, forming patterns that some believe may represent maps of rivers and hunting grounds. In these villages, creativity was not a luxury but a constant companion, woven into daily life alongside survival. Beauty, ritual, and symbol lived beside hunger and cold. These clusters of dwellings mark a profound threshold in human history. For here, on the Mammoth Steppe, the idea of home began to expand beyond the family. Shelter became not only personal but communal, a fabric of dwellings woven together into something larger than the sum of its parts. The Ice Age village was a rehearsal for the settlements that would one day become towns, cities, civilizations. The bones of mammoths framed the walls, but it was cooperation that framed the village. In the glow of shared fires, in the exchange of meat and stories, in the collective raising of shelters, humans discovered the strength of living together. These villages were fragile, temporary, vulnerable to weather and fate, but within them flickered the first sparks of society. The cold had forced them closer, and in doing so, it gave rise to something new. The architecture not only of shelter, but of community. From these frozen villages, humanity learned one of its oldest lessons, that survival is not solitary, but shared. Among the heaps of mammoth ribs and tusks, amid the blackened hearths and discarded flint flakes, archaeologists have found objects that do not quite fit the category of tool or dwelling. Carved ivory figurines, animal-shaped pendants, bones, incised with patterns of lines and dots, things that hint at a deeper layer of life in these Ice Age villages. Ritual, symbol, belief. To build a home from the bones of a mammoth was already an act steeped in meaning. The mammoth was more than prey. It was a giant, a creature of power and danger, a being whose body could sustain an entire band. To take its bones and set them into the walls of one's shelter was to live inside its body, to be cradled by its strength. Some archaeologists have suggested that these houses were not only practical refuges, but also shrines, sanctuaries of bone that wove the spiritual and the physical into a single space. Consider the placement of skulls. At mammoth skulls were stacked deliberately, tusks arranged outward like gateways. Some scholars believe they were positioned to guard entrances, their massive forms serving as protective spirits. Others see them as markers of identity, reminders of successful hunts and the collective power of the group. Whatever the interpretation, the deliberate choice to use skulls, the seat of the animal's gaze, cannot be dismissed as purely functional. Then there are the carvings. Tiny figurines of women, often exaggerated in form, appear across Ice Age Europe, the so-called Venus figurines. While none were found inside the mammoth bone houses themselves, similar carvings of ivory and bone appear nearby, suggesting that symbolic objects were part of daily life. Perhaps they were amulets, charms of fertility and survival. Perhaps they were storytellers, representations of ancestors or deities whispered about by firelight. On some mammoth bones, archaeologists have found incised markings, patterns of crochets, zigzags, and dots. To our eyes, they seem abstract, but they may have been calendars, recording the phases of the moon, or the cycles of migration. Or they may have been purely symbolic, ritual marks carved in moments of quiet intensity, giving shape to thoughts and fears too large for words. In either case, they suggest that the builders of these bone houses were not only engineers and hunters, but thinkers who carried in their minds a symbolic universe. Fire itself carried ritual weight. The hearth was not simply fire, it was sacred, the axis around which life revolved. To keep it burning was to keep the group alive, but also to honor forces beyond human control. Some evidence suggests that ashes were collected and placed in pits, carefully covered, as though returning something to the earth. In this act we glimpse the possibility of ceremony, of reverence woven into the rhythms of survival. Imagine a winter night in such a dwelling. The storm howls outside, hides strain against their lashings. Snow buries the world in silence. Inside, the fire glows. Shadows crawl across tusks and furs. An elder lifts a carved bone, etched with lines, and traces them with a finger as he speaks of the hunt, of the spirits of the great beasts, of ancestors whose bones now lie beneath the snow. Children listen wide-eyed. Adults nod, sharpening spears in the firelight. In this moment, survival and meaning are inseparable, the structure of bone around them both shield and temple. To live in such a place was to dwell at the intersection of necessity and belief. Every wall, every hide, every fire carried not only the weight of survival but also of symbolism. The mammoth bone houses were not just shelters, they were vessels of memory, of ritual, of the unseen forces that bound the living to the dead, the human to the animal, the present to the eternal. And when these villages were abandoned, the bones left behind were not simply ruins. They were traces of ritual landscapes, sites to which groups might return, re-inhabiting not just a shelter but a sacred space already heavy with memory. In these rituals of bone and shadow, we see the beginnings of something profoundly human, the need to make meaning in the midst of hardship, to weave survival into story, and to find in the coldest of worlds not only refuge, but reverence. For thousands of winters, mammoth bone shelters stood against the winds of the Pleistocene. They rose and fell with the seasons, were abandoned and rebuilt, their knowledge passed down across generations. Yet like the mammoths themselves, these strange and mighty dwellings eventually vanished from the world. The reason was not a single catastrophe, but a convergence of forces. Around 15,000 years ago, the ice began to loosen its grip. The climate warmed, glaciers retreated, and the mammoth stepped a vast, treeless grassland that had sustained both humans and herds, slowly dissolved into forests and wetlands. With the grasslands went the mammoths, dwindling until only scattered populations remained in the far north, isolated and vulnerable. The disappearance of the mammoth was more than the loss of a food source. It unraveled an entire way of life. Without mammoth herds, there were no great hunts. No stockpiles of bone to build with, no massive tusks to form the ribs of shelters. Humans adapted, as they always have. They turned to reindeer, horse, and bison, creatures abundant in the changing landscapes. But these animals did not yield the colossal skeletons required to build villages of bone. New materials had to be sought in the forests of a warming Europe. Wood replaced ivory. Trees offered poles and planks that could be cut, carried, and reshaped. Bark, branches, and logs became the framework of new dwellings, lighter, easier to build, less bound to the singular event of a mammoth kill. Instead of colossal communal shelters, smaller, more mobile tents of hide and wood emerged, following the seasonal rhythms of game and river, where bone houses had represented permanence, rootedness, and the collective effort of entire groups. These new structures embodied mobility and flexibility, but the fading of the bone houses was not only environmental, it was cultural. As groups spread and landscapes diversified, so too did their technologies and traditions. The memory of living inside mammoth bones, of arranging skulls in protective rings and stacking tusks like doorways, gave way to new architectural logics. Pit houses sunk into the ground, huts of timber and thatch, tents of hide stretched across reindeer antlers. Each was suited to its world, just as the bone houses had been to theirs. And yet, even in absence, the legacy of the mammoth dwellings lingered. The idea of building in circles, of clustering homes into villages, of orienting entrances to the sun, of zoning space for storage, rest, and ritual, these were not abandoned. They carried forward, transmuted into new forms. Architecture, once born in ivory and fire, now found expression in wood, clay, and stone. When we look at the ruins of Mezirich or Kastenki, today those tangled circles of ivory weathered into the soil, it is easy to see only what was lost. The giants that no longer roam, the shelters that no longer stand, the silence where once smoke and laughter rose. But perhaps it is better to see them as the first chapter of an unbroken story. For from these houses of bone grew the idea of the home itself, a place not merely to sleep, but to gather, to endure, to symbolize, to belong. The mammoth bone houses did not survive the end of the Ice Age, but the people who built them did, carrying forward the lessons of structure, of cooperation, of imagination. In every dwelling, raised Cincian, huts, yurts, longhouses, cottages, and cities, we find their legacy still alive. The bones returned to the earth, but the architecture remained in us. The mammoth bone houses stand at the threshold between survival and civilization. They were not palaces, nor temples, nor monuments. They were shelters against the wind, crude domes stitched from hide and bone. And yet, in their geometry, their communal clustering, their ritual weight, they revealed the birth of something far greater, the human instinct to shape space with intention. For here, in the frozen silence of the steppe, architecture was born, not as artifice, not as grandeur, but as necessity infused with meaning. The builders of Mezirich and Kastenki, of Gansi and Moldova, were not simply engineers of bone, they were designers of worlds. Each dwelling was a diagram of life, the fire as sun, the walls as horizon, the entrance as threshold, the clustering of homes as community. The material was mammoth, but the form was human imagination. From these beginnings, the line extends unbroken. The circle of bones becomes the circle of stones at Göbekli Tepe, the timber huts of the Neolithic, the mud brick houses of Jericho. From there rise the ziggurats, pyramids, temples, and towers, each new form echoing an ancient gesture, to enclose space, to give it order, to make it speak of belonging and belief. The cathedrals of Europe, the pagodas of Asia, the mosques of the Middle East all carry within them the same spark that first lit inside a bone house beneath the Ice Age sky. The mammoth bone dwellings remind us of what architecture truly is. It is not merely walls and roofs. It is the act of making place. It is survival, yes, but survival shaped by thought, by imagination, by the will to transform a hostile world into a lived one. In bone and hide, in wood and clay, in steel and glass, the principle endures. Humans are the species that builds, not only to endure, but to mean. And so when we look upon the ruins of those ancient houses, ivory arcs collapsed into the soil, we are not looking at failures swallowed by time. We are looking at origins, at the first sketches of a human language of space, at the earliest proof that even in the harshest cold, people carried within them the warmth of vision. The mammoth bone houses are gone. Their makers long vanished, their beasts extinct, but their story remains alive in us. Every time we gather around a hearth, every time we raise walls against the wind, every time we imagine a space before we build it, we are repeating an act that began there. In the shadow of the mammoth dot, the ice age passed, but architecture stayed. Though the mammoth bone houses themselves are gone, their echoes remain buried in the soil, waiting for careful hands to reveal them. Archaeology has become the second life of these structures, the afterlife of architecture. Each rib, each tusk, each scatter of flint and ash tells a fragment of a story, and together they let us glimpse the people who once bent bone into shelter. The discoveries began humbly. In the 19th century, peasants in Ukraine unearthed strange heaps of ivory while digging cellars. At first, many believed they had found the remains of biblical giants or ancient fortresses. Only later did archaeologists recognize them as dwellings, their circles of bones, the outlines of lost homes. Over the decades, more were uncovered: Kostenki on the Don River, Mazirik and Gansi in the Dnieper Valley, Moldova on the Dniester. Each site offered not only bones but tools, ornaments, and traces of fire. Each became a window onto a vanished Ice Age world. To excavate such a site is to walk backwards through time. A heap of ribs, once a wall. A scatter of flints, once a toolkit. Layers of ash, once the warmth of countless meals. Archaeologists sift soil grain by grain, mapping bones in place, preserving the fragile geometry of shelters that have not stood for 20,000 years. It is painstaking work, yet in those patterns, the curve of a tusk aligned with another. The deliberate stacking of skulls. The ring of Hearthswan sees the ghost of the house rise again. The finds have not only fascinated science, but imagination. Artists reconstruct the villages and paint in digital renderings. Domes of hide glowing with firelight. Mammoth tusks gleaming in snow. People huddled against the wind. Museums display the bones under glass, their massive weight both alien and familiar. In classrooms, children learn that their distant ancestors once built houses from the skeletons of giants. What was once survival has become story, woven into our collective memory, and yet, the bones themselves still speak in ways we are only beginning to hear. New methods: radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, microscopic where studies allow scientists to read them more deeply. They tell of diets, rich in mammoth meat, of hides tanned and worn, of ornaments carried far from their source. They reveal not just how the houses were built, but how life was lived inside them. What was cooked, what was carved, what was believed. Every excavation is both a recovery and a loss. To uncover a mammoth bone house is to disturb a place that has lain quiet for millennia. Once the bones are removed, the circle is broken. The original house can never be whole again. Archaeologists document with care, photograph, draw, measure, but they know that what they touch is fragile. A fleeting window before it collapses back into silence. Still, there is a kind of poetry in this. For just as the Ice Age people built their homes from the remains of great beasts, so we now rebuild those homes from the remains of memory. We are their descendants, not only in blood, but in imagination. They shaped bone into shelter. We shape bone into story. Both acts are architecture of a kind, one of survival, one of remembrance. The mammoth bone houses may no longer stand against the wind, but they endure beneath our feet and within our minds. And in every excavation trench, as another circle of ivory emerges from the soil, we are reminded. The past is not gone, only hidden, waiting to be rebuilt in us. The mammoth bone houses may belong to the Ice Age, but their story belongs to us. They remind us that even in the harshest conditions, humans have always been makers of shelter, meaning, and community. From ivory arcs to steel towers, every wall we raise is part of the same long lineage, the architecture of survival and imagination. Now, the question turns to us. What will we build in our own age of shifting climates and fragile futures? What materials will we choose? What stories will we embed in our walls? What hearths will we gather around? The people of the steppe built with what they had: bone, hide, fire, and they made spaces that carried not only life, but spirit. We too must build with what we have, not only to endure, but to honor the living world, to leave behind structures that mean as much as they protect. Their bones have returned to the earth. Their fire burns in us. Let us carry it forward.